Few Supreme Court decisions in recent memory have so captured the attention of the American public as Citizens United. To help me explore the road to Citizens United, as well as consider the potential paths leading beyond it, is Timothy Kuhner, Associate Law Professor at Georgia State University College of Law. Professor Kuhner's scholarship has been cited in the Yale Law Journal, Harvard Law Review, and the American Journal of Comparative Law, and he is most recently the author of Capitalism v. Democracy, Money in Politics and the Free Market Constitution. Welcome, Tim.
Thanks, Peter.
Thanks for joining me.
It's a pleasure.
Let's go back to the beginning, as it were. 1976, Supreme Court, the case Buckley v. Vallejo, setting the tone for money and politics cases. What did it say about how the political and the economic spheres should interact in our democracy?
It said what it accomplished was to eliminate the distinction between the political and the economic spheres. Okay. And it said so in fairly open language. So this is a case about the first comprehensive federal election campaign act at the federal level that had ever been passed in U.S. history. And it contained contribution limits to campaigns, to candidates, to parties. It contained expenditure limits by candidates, by outside speakers, and so on. It contained a limited public financing system for presidential campaigns. And the part that bothered the Supreme Court the most was the expenditure limits. And so when you're in the realm of expenditure limits, you're talking about limiting the total volume of economic power that the candidates and the parties are putting out there. And in examining that question, the Supreme Court basically said democracy is a market. Money is speech. Political equality is an unconstitutional rationale to limit this market, and that the entire United States was forced into this free market constitutional realm, which we hadn't occupied before. And so it was really a radical moment. And in a number of ways, and maybe we can get to this later, let's hear what else you want to talk about, but in a number of ways, this is a 200-year-old trajectory. Not just in 1976, but in many ways this traces back to 1776.
Okay, all right. Well, let's actually look back essentially to that era. Insofar as I'm wondering what it is back in 76, that's the Burger Court, I believe. What are they looking back to? The Constitution did not address corporate personhood. It didn't address issues of campaign financing. So what other than the ideological beliefs of the individuals on the court at that time, what did they have to look back to establish what I imagine they were hoping to put the law on firm legal foundations, looking back to the Constitution or founding documents? What were they looking to?
They weren't looking to founding documents. They weren't looking to early debates. They were looking to this is a case of first impression. So this is the first time the court would consider the constitutionality of contribution limits and expenditure limits. And when you read through the opinion and you hear the language about the best test of truth being the power of the thought to get itself accepted into the competition of the market. When you hear that kind of language, you understand that they're mixing two spheres, the economic sphere and the political sphere. The one thing they do cite for that very proposition about the best test of truth being the market is a 1919 dissent by Justice Holmes in a case called Abrams v. U.S. But the thing about Abrams is that it's a case about a conviction of two individuals under the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act for throwing leaflets that countered U.S. involvement in Russia, sending troops over to Russia in 1918. So when Holmes dissented from that conviction and the Supreme Court's upholding of that conviction, Holmes was saying, look, these people who are against U.S. militarism in Russia ought to be allowed to get that viewpoint out to the general public. So the best test of the truth of what U.S. foreign policy engagement should be is its ability to get accepted in the market, but the market metaphorically, because this wasn't a case about the use of money. Buckley was. So when Buckley says the best test of truth is its ability to get accepted into the market competition, they mean an actual market of competing expenditures, price signals.
Well, and let's take that question up. Certainly, since '76. in Supreme Court decisions that are involving money in politics, the overwhelming language and metaphor is the market. To what extent does that metaphor seem to be appropriate in a conversation dealing with the political sphere and with democracy? And at what point do you feel the market metaphor and that language sort of that breaks down and disserves our democracy in the political sphere?
Sure. I think Holmes is exactly right in a limited sense. I think it's right to conceive of democracy as a metaphorical market in the sense that, well, this market could be captured by economic power. There could be a monopoly or an oligopoly of corporate spenders. You want to avoid that. We need a competitive, accessible market where people have genuine debate. That sort of thing, but that's all a metaphor. When you take Holmes's reasoning and put it into a case about the role of financial power, you're saying that the rule for political competition is the ability and willingness to spend. And when you look at the data about who is donating to our campaigns and our parties and who is behind most of the money going to super PACs and all of that unaccountable outside speech, it's this tiny, tiny fraction of 1% of the population. So they're the ones, quite literally now, cornering a market. The catch is that democracy is not supposed to be a market. If it is, it excludes those without much purchasing power. Right. And that's where we are today.
Right, exactly that. And if we accept, as the court did in Buckley, that money is, it's a slippery slope, that money is an increasingly vital tool in the way that politics are conducted in the 21st century, it's very easy to slip into the notion that money is what secures speech, and money is speech. How can we delink those two ideas and keep money where money belongs and allow speech? Because obviously the corollary is that those with more money have more speech.
Right. Right. It has to be a balance. Yep. The thing about political finance or campaign finance in the United States is that we are at an extreme. We are at a global extreme. The countries that have more money in politics proportionally than we do are countries where actual bribery and abject corruption are just running rampant. We're the only country in the world where an official government actor, in our case the Supreme Court, justifies this system of tremendously large contributions and expenditures, determining, maybe that's too strong, but unduly influencing, very closely controlling the platforms of political parties, which candidacies are viable and which candidacies are not viable, what the tone and topics of outside speech are. Now, does that mean that money isn't related to speech? No, money is related to speech as long as you have a privatized media, right? Money is related to speech as long as there aren't very significant public subsidies to give campaigns and candidates, parties, outside funds in a way that's guaranteed, or accessible or free media time for campaigns. And that would inject more competition, and it would also lessen the dependence or the dependency of office holders who are running for re-election, of parties, of candidates, their dependency on large donors and spenders. So I'm in favor of some protection for money and even some degree of corporate spending, but our system is at a true extreme. We need to know what those corporations think, of course. We need to know what millionaires and billionaires think, fine. But we don't need to have that dominate our electoral discourse, and that's our mistake.
Right. And a millionaire or billionaire should have the one vote that you and I have as well.
Right.
You're speaking in global terms, so I'm wondering, certainly other advanced democracies are dealing with this issue as well, would be my thought. And certainly their intention is to also protect the freedom of speech of their citizens. So how have they gone about limiting the corrosive effects of money in politics?
Actually, through a number of the mechanisms I just mentioned. So it's very common to have that free media time. It's common to also have some postage and mailing subsidized. And it's very common to have roughly 50% of political parties' election-related expenses, if not their general operating expenses, covered through government subsidies. Wow. So those are common methods. Limitations of contributions from private individuals, limitations on corporate contributions and corporate expenditures vary quite a bit. And there's very respectable democracies that don't limit those sources too strictly. It's just that they offset them with significant public financing. Right. And so the US is so interesting. We have this very privatized model of governance because we don't have good subsidies. The only federal races we really subsidize are presidential, and those subsidies are now almost insignificant, and most candidates are going to be turning them down, I think, going forward. The Congress is entirely privatized in that sense. It's $10 million to become a senator, $1 million on average to become a member of the House. And so in the absence of those public subsidies, in the absence of expenditure limits, then there's no ceiling to how high the demand for funds can be. There's no ceiling on how high the supply of funds can be. And so there's this arms race for who's going to have the most financial power and therefore speech. Right.
Now, the title of your book, Capitalism v. Democracy, sort of sets up a dynamic that you don't believe is inevitable. It need not be capitalism against democracy, as it were. In fact, you argue that while money in politics erodes democracy, it also weakens capitalism. How do you feel money in politics debases capitalism, and how do you imagine it might coexist peacefully with how we envision our democracy functioning?
Right. I don't think it's a coincidence that capitalism and democracy emerged together in 1776 in this country. The system of oppression that we were under during our time as a colony under King George III in the last instance was a system where royal birth, so the monarchy, had true dominion over politics and economics, right? And the economic model under kings is this mercantilist model where the economy serves the state. And so there's the corruption of the economy. There's also, in a sense, the corruption of the political sphere because people don't have political power. The sovereign monarch does. And so when you have this remarkable revolution against England, and when we come out of that victorious, both freedom in the economy and freedom in the political sphere emerge simultaneously because there's no one person tying them both down, and they can both be separated out from under the weight of a monarch. And so that emergence, and they're compatible sorts of freedoms in theory, right? I mean, in practice we had slavery, but in theory we're talking about the right of people to choose their own careers. We're talking about the ability of people, when they're good at something, to get ahead on that basis. It shouldn't be who the king appoints or the king decides. It should be on the basis of your effort and your energy and your talent. And your ability to make connections and make projects with people and to see the need in society for one type of service or one type of product and innovate and innovate and innovate and innovate without the state coming in and saying, well, we want most of that stuff. We want that money. We're going to nationalize your company. We're going to take it over and that kind of thing. And so, Jefferson's favorite book in political economy was Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. And Adam Smith publishes his Wealth of Nations in 1776, Jefferson's Declaration of Independence in the same year. I see these systems as emancipatory, freedom-promoting systems. And they're so busy defeating their various adversaries. Monarchy and theocracy were the big adversaries of democracy. Dictatorship was the big. Communism. And we're so busy, right? And communism, the big enemy of capitalism. We're so busy with these fights throughout our history that we don't really confront the question of which system, capitalism or democracy, governs the other. We don't really confront that system as our main question until the end of the Cold War. And that's when corruption takes off. Once democracy and capitalism are the dominant forms of government everywhere, then all of a sudden you see, wow, the road to political power now is financial power. It's not military power like dictatorship. It's not royal birth like monarchy. It's not religious authority like theocracy. And so the real form of tyranny becomes plutocracy coming out of that.
Let me shift gears a little bit. Although looking back to that time, I believe the Bill of Rights is celebrating a birthday this year, 225 years. Over that 225 years, there have only been 17 amendments added to our Constitution. Yet you, like some members of our U.S. Senate most recently, believe that a constitutional amendment addressing the issue of money in politics is not only appropriate, but necessary. Why a constitutional amendment and not some other form of remedy?
Sure. A constitutional amendment is necessary because the Supreme Court, when it says the Constitution means that corporations have a First Amendment right to an unlimited general treasury fund expenditures, when it says that political equality is an unconstitutional rationale for reforming political spending and campaigns, when it says that money is speech protected by the First Amendment, when it says those things, it's as though the Constitution has already been amended to mean those things. The Supreme Court, when it lays down its constitutional interpretations, can't be contradicted by any person or government organ. The only exception is a constitutional amendment, or I suppose the subsequent Supreme Court contradicting itself years later, as it has done, especially in campaign finance reform. There have been so many radical reversals because it's ideological. So you get the progressive ideology, and that does some damage to what the Burger Court was up to. And then you get the Roberts Court doubling down on free market ideology and reversing what the Rehnquist Court was up to. And so you get that pendulum swing. But that, of course, is unacceptable for a country that actually wants to take itself seriously as a democracy. You can't have the financing of your elections and your parties and your outside speech go this way or that way, depending on 5 unelected judges. It has to go in a democratic way and a capitalist way, as decided by 3/4 of the states and 2/3 of the Congress. And this should be a bipartisan thing in the sense that, in relation to your prior question, political spending is corrupting capitalism just as much as it's corrupting democracy. And when large interests and millionaires and billionaires are controlling electoral debate and political parties, they're doing it for economic reasons. There's a few ideologues out there, sure, but mostly this is about your bottom line. You know, it's about your investments, it's about your company, it's about your holdings, it's about getting favorable terms through politics that you can then bring back into economics, into your business affairs, and do better than you were doing before against a rival industry, against a rival company, whatever it is. And it's just not a coincidence that Ayn Rand, that Adam Smith himself, that these conservative icons came out against money in politics, saying, look, these are restraints on competition. These are pull peddlers, right? Ayn Rand called lobbyists pull peddlers, and she called office holders who get these political favors men with political pull. You don't want your economic competition varying in accordance with who is pulling the strings of government. That's not properly capitalistic in the least.
The move for the constitutional amendment in the Senate fell. Is that the end of it? Do you sense that, for the time being at any rate, that's the end of it? Is there something more that we as citizens can do to press the issue with legislators? Certainly in Massachusetts, our senators supported the amendment. But what do you recommend we do as individuals or collectively?
Right, collectively and as individuals, it's taking a step back. Now, I don't mean back from pushing for an amendment. I mean taking a step back from our situation, from all of these changes that are right under our nose. You know, the rising cost of elections, the billion-dollar presidency, Obama's rallies being 100% less in quantity than his fundraisers, the ALEC and all of these draft laws coming out of business interests and being submitted right into state legislatures and passing, these speeches ghostwritten by lobbyists and read by representatives. We've got to take a step back from all of these concrete signs and ask what they mean. And as we start to come to terms with the fact that our democracy is being privatized, that it doesn't make sense to speak in terms of popular sovereignty anymore, but rather in terms of consumer sovereignty. That doesn't make sense to think history is ended. There's no more grand battles to be fought. It's over. Capitalism and democracy won. That's the end of history. No. Wealth is the last lawful means of political exclusion. This is a trajectory from Jacksonian democracy, eliminating the property requirement on the vote so that all white males could vote, through the abolition of slavery, through African American suffrage, female suffrage, the abolition of poll taxes, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. This is an evolution that we're still part of. And it only ends when we say, this just seems too big. This is just inconvenient. We have to get real and present and conscious to what's happening to our democracy, because when power gets consolidated in the very wealthy and in corporate entities, it's harder and harder. Every year that we let go by, it's harder and harder to reverse these changes. And if you look at our history, it's the history of this country and social movements doing impossible things. And this is nothing like the gravity of slavery. I mean, that was a much harder fight. Female suffrage, African American suffrage, these were monumental fights, and I think we need to look back at that and say we're proud of that heritage, and we're not giving up on this tradition of fighting the good fights for the right reasons.
Yeah. So you suggest, so slavery, women's suffrage, those were larger hurdles to surmount than obviously exceedingly vested interests, and quite powerful interests that are lobbying to maintain the status quo here. But in that context, perhaps it seems a little bit more doable.
That's the way I feel about it. I mean, I look back at these historical struggles and I think, all right, so we're left with money in politics, which makes perfect sense because we don't condition power anymore on religious hierarchy or race or sex or royal birth like the king. We now condition political power primarily on the vote, but it turns out that the vote isn't as primary as we think, because you can't exercise your vote until candidacies and campaigns have been formed and mounted and have fought out those initial battles, whether for the nomination of a party or whether to get on the ballot or whether simply to be known by a sufficient quantity of people. And that whole process prior to the vote determines who you get to vote for. And it determines the platforms and the messages that are being thrown out that are infiltrating your skull and that are creating in you a sense of here's what's possible politically and here's what the issues are. And so we need a process that is also accountable and representative and fair for that whole initial move prior to the vote. Otherwise, the vote is like which box of cereal are you going to pull from the shelf. They all have sugar. They're all going to kill you. But hey, you get to choose between red and green.
Well, and actually, one of the interesting observations you make in the book is that people not voting is because they feel that their vote has very little impact. To a certain extent, is a rational choice. Why would I go and do this when it's not going to make any difference? The irrationality of it becomes when we continue to abstain from voting, and we don't simultaneously seek to change the system so that it is different. Is there anything along those lines that we can do? Certainly we can talk about constitutional amendments. Certainly we can talk about sort of changing issues around campaign finance. But anything else you can suggest? Certainly one of the things we try to do is provide people with action steps.
Great.
Anything you can
Sure.
think of?
Sure. I mean, so the ultimate fix for this, right, the way to correct what the court has said and to throw back all of those crazy ideas about democracy being an actual market and political power really being about price signals and all of that craziness has to be corrected. And so that's an enduring project that will have to involve a constitutional amendment unless you want to rely on the benevolence of whichever Supreme Court justice happened to have been appointed and nominated in your particular lifespan, and that's not a dependable solution. So if we're looking at the enduring solution, the good news is that it has a bunch of levels. So there are over 500 municipalities that have signed on to a proposed constitutional amendment. There's, I think, 16 states now that have signed on. There are millions of citizens who have signed on through petitions that are sent to the Congress. And you can be part of that move to amend the Constitution in many different layers.
So sort of taking it back, making it a local issue as well.
Make it a local issue and press the issue of campaign finance with your elected representatives at every level. At your local, your municipal level, your state level, your federal level. Press it, because until campaign finance becomes more salient than all of the other things we're talking about, they're never going to get to it. And so you can vote based on the platform of people, of candidates on money in politics, and they may not develop those platforms until those platforms are demanded. So there is still, of course, significant power in the vote, but sometimes that power has to be to change the game and to demand an entirely different sort of representative, an entirely different sort of public debate.
So is there anything else you think would be important for our viewers to know about?
One thing to throw out there is that by being involved in money in politics, you are involved in a long-standing American tradition that is responding to the issues of your day, but you're part of this significant heritage. I think it's very interesting to recognize that Abraham Lincoln, a year before the Civil War ended, said that he referenced the rise of corporations through the Civil War, and he said that changes in corporate economic power made him worry more than anything else, even in the midst of that war. And he said that if this trend continues, it'll be the end of democracy. And power will be vested in very few hands. Thomas Jefferson said something virtually identical several decades earlier, but early figures who are responsible for the way our Constitution looks and the way the course of our nation has gone, right, abolishing slavery, Thomas Jefferson, the separation of church and state, and then, of course, the Declaration of Independence, they saw ahead to money in politics, but it wasn't their historical moment to correct it. But when you look at their thinking, right, they're referencing this aristocracy, that's what Jefferson called it, an aristocracy of moneyed and corporations. They're referencing a rise of a different form of power that would threaten what they were working so hard to create in the form of a meaningful democracy. And those warnings about a growing aristocracy and growing inequality and the republic being over are encapsulated in the economic findings today, say by Thomas Piketty, stating that and noting that presently in the United States, the top 10% of the population owns 70% of our national wealth. The bottom 50%, okay, it would be neat if they owned the remaining 30% or 20% or something like that, but they own 2%. So the lower 50% owns 2%, the top 10% owns 70%. And Piketty, as an economist, says, this isn't going to work. Economic systems don't work with that degree of inequality. There will be revolutions, and he traces back all the different revolutions that occurred. And so what I'm trying to say is that this is a structural problem that was appreciated by our constitutional architects as they moved forward in their lives. And what Jefferson left us, along with Roger Williams, in this separation of church and state, stopped theocracy. There could not be religious authority controlling our political system officially because we have that separation. When you look at our findings about inequality and you look at the findings about rising money in politics and how unaccountable this is getting, clearly we're heading towards another form of tyranny, right, in the form of plutocracy. And so when I say that we could be part of this movement to amend the Constitution, I mean a third separation, all right? The separation of powers prevented the executive from being like a king by absorbing the powers of every other branch of government. Separation of church and state, as I just said. And now we need a theory for this separation, this third separation between economic power and political power. And that, in my mind, is a separation of business and state. And that's another constitutional project and another mass movement. And I think that's a really exciting thing to be part of and to say, look, there are tons of issues up for grabs still, this big one. And I can be part of that.
Embrace the possibility.
Right. We have a lot on our plates, but we could embrace the possibility of being part of a profound change that's necessary for the success or endurance of capitalism and democracy both. And that would be a really meaningful political life, beyond just kind of getting things done in our daily lives.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for speaking with me today. Thanks so much for your book, and I will look forward to the next book on Citizens United.
Thanks, Peter. It was a pleasure for me.
Thank you. Amongst the important things in life we're told money can't buy are health, love, and happiness. I suppose at the time it went without saying that democracy belonged on the list as well. Our mistake that we took it for granted. The encouraging news today is that 70% of we Americans, of all political hues, disagree with the Citizens United ruling. That's a good starting point. To continue that journey, however, we need to cultivate activism and persistence. For while equality and access may be our birthrights, they have never been conceded without demand. Let's get working. On behalf of Tim Kuhner, I'm Peter Bermudez for Arlington Public News.